Okay, let's just jump right in. When you look at the living world, the sheer variety it's just staggering. You've got millions and millions of species out there, and each one is kind of following its own complex recipe for survival. But what are the fundamental laws that govern all this biodiversity? What keeps it all ticking?
And what allows it to change over deep time? That's really what we want to get into in this deep dive. Our sources merge two massive fields, ecology and evolution.
Right, so ecology is about the rules of survival right now.
Exactly, the interactions. And evolution is the mechanism for how things fundamentally change over generations.
So the knowledge we're pulling out for you today isn't just a list of definitions. It's about connecting the dots, right?
Yeah.
We're going from the huge scale, like entire biomes, down to the tiniest scale, like DNA.
All to give you this essential picture of how life hangs on under constant pressure. And we have to start with the environment itself. To really get any living system, you first have to separate the players. You've got your biotic factors, the living stuff, plants, animals, microbes, all of it. And then you have the abiotic factors.
So the non-living things, like sunlight, temperature, water, that sort of thing.
Precisely. And those two sets of factors define, every single place on Earth. And when you're talking about scale, we can talk about populations, which is one species in one place.
Like all the pike in a lake.
Right. Or a community, which is all the different populations together. But the real magic happens when you bundle all of that into the ecosystem.
Okay, so the ecosystem is the big picture.
It's the whole package. The community of living things, plus the physical, non-living environment they all depend on. It's this dynamic system where energy and matter are just constantly cycling between the living and the non-living.
This brings us to the power of place. But it's more than just an address, isn't it? We need to talk about the ecological niche. I feel like people often hear it summarized as an organism's job, but that feels a little simple.
It is. It's so much more comprehensive. The niche covers everything an organism needs and does. Its habitat, what it eats, where it breeds, when it's active, its precise role in the whole operation.
The classic example of hawks and owls is so good here. On the surface, they could be fighting for resources all the time.
Yeah.
They hunt in the same areas, they eat a lot of the same prey, like mice, but they get along. Why?
Because they occupy fundamentally different niches. The key difference is time. The owl is nocturnal. It's got silent flight, short wings for getting through trees at night. The hawk,
It's the day shift.
it's the day shift. It's built for soaring high up. So they're using the same resource,
Yeah.
but they avoid that head-on competition by using different time slots and even different spaces within that habitat.
I never really thought about how clean that separation could be. It's like an evolutionary agreement to avoid each other.
That's the elegance of ecological balance. And while we're defining these systems, we have to talk about the border zones, the ecotones.
These are the transition areas, right? Like where a pond meets a field.
Yeah, exactly. And the really key thing to understand about ecotones is that they are often richer in life than the ecosystems on either side.
So the edge is where the action is.
Totally. You get species from the pond, species from the field, and then you get unique species that need a bit of both. It's a huge driver for local biodiversity.
But all of this life is, of course, governed by limits. No population just grows forever.
Even if it has a massive biotic potential, that's the theoretical maximum number of offspring it could produce. Our sources have this wild example of a fern. It can produce over 50,000 spores a year. If they all survived, we'd be, swimming in ferns.
Which brings us to maybe the most critical concept in ecology, carrying capacity. This is the max number of individuals of one species that an ecosystem can support forever, basically.
Indefinitely, yeah. And that number isn't static. It's always shifting based on food, water, nesting sites, all of it. Think of field mice. If their predators, say hawks and owls, disappear for a season, the mice population just explodes.
Overshoots that capacity.
Way overshoots it. They eat all the food, they get sick, and the population crashes right back down.
And that crash is the ecosystem basically hitting the reset button, bringing the population back towards its carrying capacity.
And that kind of limiting factor, one that depends on the population size, is called a density-dependent factor. Crowding makes it worse.
And this is all refined by a couple of classic ecological laws. There's the law of the minimum.
Right, which says your growth isn't limited by how much stuff you have in total, but by the one single nutrient that's in the shortest supply. If you're missing phosphorus, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you have, phosphorus is your limit.
And then there's Shelford's law of tolerance, which connects the organism back to those abiotic non-living factors.
It basically says an organism has an optimal range for things like temperature or saltiness, and the further you get from that sweet spot, the harder it is to survive. Cross a certain threshold, and that's it. It doesn't matter if everything else is perfect.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. We have the rules of the game:
Hmm.
capacity, niche, tolerance. But what happens when an outside force, usually us, human activity, just comes in and smashes those rules?
Now you're moving into density-independent factors. These are things like a chemical spill or a flood. They affect everyone in the population equally, no matter how crowded it is. And one of the biggest ones is the introduction of invasive species.
The case studies here are they're mind-blowing. Let's start with the earthworms in Kananaskis in Alberta. This was an area that historically had no earthworms at all.
Yeah, the glaciers wiped them out. But researchers found that probably from eggs stuck to hiking boots or cars, worms got back in. And by 2004, they found densities of up to 2,500 worms per square meter.
Wow.
And here's the crucial part. They completely change the forest floor. They devour the layer of leaf litter that native plants depend on, which changes everything. Soil temperature, moisture, erosion.
An entire ecosystem gets re-engineered from the ground up, just because this new species has no natural enemies there.
And that is the exact same story with the European starling.
Oh, this one is incredible. A Shakespeare fan in the 1890s.
Yep. Decided he wanted every bird from Shakespeare's plays to live in America. So he releases just 60 starlings in Central Park.
60.
60. And from that tiny group, there are now an estimated 200 million of them across North America.
And they're not friendly neighbors. They're aggressive. They're cavity nesters, and they take over. They'll physically throw the eggs and babies of native birds like the mountain bluebird right out of the nest.
It is a shocking level of unintended consequence from one person's strange hobby. And it's not just the land. Our waterways are just as vulnerable. The zebra mussel from the Caspian Sea got into the Great Lakes from the ballast water of ships.
And they just cover everything, right? Pipes, boats, other native mussels.
They choke everything out. And you see the same thing with plants, like purple loosestrife. It came over accidentally, and now it just dominates wetlands, crowding out all the native plants that are critical for the habitat.
Which is a huge problem, because wetlands are so important.
They're critical. They get called biological supermarkets for a reason. They support these immense food webs, but they also protect us from floods. They're like giant natural sponges. So when you lose them, the effects ripple out everywhere.
Speaking of huge effects, let's talk about forests.
Hmm.
The sources say something like a third of the Earth's forests are already gone, and how they're cleared makes all the difference.
Oh, absolutely. You've got clear cutting, where they just take down every tree in a huge area. It's fast, it's cheap, but the environmental cost is massive. You get instant soil erosion, huge water runoff.
And then they replant. But it's often just one single fast-growing species, a monoculture, which is incredibly fragile and just terrible for biodiversity.
Right, and you contrast that with selective cutting, where you're only harvesting certain trees. It lets the forest regenerate more naturally. It maintains the ecosystem's integrity.
We see a similar thing happening in lakes, right? This
Right.
kind of accelerated aging process called eutrophication.
Yeah, it's how a lake goes from being oligotrophic, which is deep, clear, cold, and nutrient poor.
And all our life.
Right, to being eutrophic, shallow, warm, murky, and full of algae and plants. It's a natural cycle, but it's supposed to take thousands of years.
But we're speeding it up dramatically. All the runoff from fertilizers, sewage, even just clearing vegetation to make a sandy beach at your cottage, it all dumps more nutrients into the water.
And that influx just supercharges the growth of algae and weeds. Then, when all that stuff dies and decomposes, it sucks the oxygen out of the water. And that's a disaster for cold water fish like trout that need high oxygen levels. So they die off and are replaced by fish like perch. The whole community changes.
That's such a clear picture of how human pressure can just overwhelm these natural limits.
Yeah.
So let's make this shift now from the limits of ecology to life's inherent ability to change over the long term. Evolution. What's the core evidence that species aren't just fixed things?
Well, the evidence is layered. You can start with just looking at anatomy. You look at homologous features. These are structures in different species that have the same underlying bone pattern.
Like the classic example, the forelimb of a human, a whale, a bat, and a horse. Same basic bones, humerus, radius, ulna, but they're used for totally different things.
Yeah.
Grasping, swimming, flying, running.
Exactly. It strongly suggests they all came from a common ancestor who had that original blueprint. And then you have the flip side of that, vestigial features.
These are the leftovers. The evolutionary baggage.
That's a great way to put it. They're structures that have lost their original function, like the tiny little hip bones you can find buried inside the body of a whale.
Which makes zero sense unless their ancestors walked on land.
It makes no other sense. Or the human appendix. They're powerful clues to an organism's history.
And this kind of evidence is what drove our early classification systems, like the one from Linnaeus with the two-part name, genus, and species.
It was all based on what you could see, but today our classification system is completely driven by genetics. The six-kingdom system we use now is a perfect example. It had to be created because of discoveries like the archaebacteria.
The ones that live in really extreme places like hot springs and salt lakes.
They look like regular bacteria, but their biochemistry, their DNA is profoundly different. They're a whole separate branch of life. And that molecular evidence is the ultimate confirmation of kinship. You can compare the DNA sequences of any two species.
And the more similar the DNA, the more closely related they are.
It confirms what the anatomy was suggesting all along.
So that brings us to the engine of all this change, natural selection. Darwin's big idea. He saw that 1, variations exist and are inherited, and 2, way more offspring are produced than can possibly survive.
So the conclusion is just. It's inescapable. There's a struggle for survival. And therefore, the individuals with the variations that are best suited to the environment are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those helpful traits.
That's it. That's natural selection. It's the filter. So if selection is the filter or the editor, where does the new material come from for it to even act on?
2 key places. The first, and this is the big one, is mutation. It is the only source of brand new genetic material. A random mistake in copying DNA. It can be harmful, it can be neutral.
Or it can be beneficial.
Or it can be beneficial, and if it is, it gives that organism a better shot, and it gets passed on. The second mechanism is sexual reproduction.
Which doesn't create new genes, but it shuffles the existing ones into new combinations.
An incredible number of new combinations. The source used an analogy. If you have 1,000 males and 1,000 females, you have 1 million different possible mating pairs. That shuffling creates immense variability, which is the raw material that natural selection needs to work with.
Okay, last piece here. What about the speed of evolution? The original idea was gradualism, right? Slow, steady, constant change over millions of years.
Right. But that didn't always match what we see in the fossil record. You see long periods where a species looks exactly the same, and then boom, a new species appears really abruptly. That led to the theory of punctuated equilibrium.
Which suggests that, yeah, species stay stable for a long time, but then evolution can happen really fast. I mean, fast in geological time. We're still talking thousands of years. But it happens in small, isolated populations.
Exactly. And when that small, rapidly changing group expands, it looks like it appeared overnight in the fossil record. So the pace of evolution isn't constant. It can be slow, and it can be fast.
So to wrap this all together, we've gone from the fundamental rules of ecology, abiotic limits, carrying capacity,
All the way to the disruptive forces, like invasive species and human activity that are constantly putting those rules to the test.
and then we connected that to the deep time mechanism of evolution, which is how life actually responds to those pressures through genetic variation.
The big takeaway is that there's this constant tension. Populations are always navigating their environmental limits, and their success or failure depends on whether their inherited toolkit of variations is good enough to let them adapt.
So whether it's an earthworm changing the soil or a global temperature shift pushing a fish past its tolerance.
Life is always a negotiation between external pressure and the internal capacity for change.
You know, the sources mention these ongoing debates about massive geoengineering projects like diverting huge amounts of fresh water from northern Canada down to the U.S.
Things that would fundamentally alter climate and ecosystems on a continental scale. So, considering all these limits we've talked about, carrying capacity, the fragility of these systems, the slow pace of real evolutionary adaptation.
It really makes you wonder,
Yeah.
if we deliberately pull these massive environmental levers, what's the risk? Is it possible that even the most successful species, us, has just fundamentally miscalculated the carrying capacity of the planet for ourselves?